Let your eyes grow heavy and your mind drift as we step gently into the swirling mists of the 14th century, into a city teeming with sound and scent, color and culture. Medieval Delhi, the thriving capital of the Tughlaq dynasty. Picture its broad, sun-baked streets and winding alleys, lined with camel-drawn carts, wandering ascetics, busy merchants, and curious travelers. A city of fortresses and mosques, mango groves and marble pavilions. Imagine, for a moment, you are there, not as a royal guest nor a noble dignitary, but as a traveller from a distant land, weary, dust-covered, and enticed by the lively hum of the city's famed bazaars. You hear the sizzle of food being prepared on open braziers, see baskets overflowing with spices and glistening sweets, and catch the warm scent of cardamom, cumin, and roasted lentils wafting on the wind. You're hungry, but as you approach a food stall tucked under a bamboo awning, a small sense of unease begins to stir, because what awaits your appetite here may not quite align with your modern expectations. So, as the evening deepens and stars bloom over the domes of Sultanate Delhi, let us explore why, enchanting though it may seem, you might regret indulging in the street food of 14th century Delhi. Our journey begins not with illness or alarm, but with curiosity in the rhythms of daily life. The sun has barely risen over the sandstone skyline when Delhi awakens with the chirping of miners and the distant clatter of hooves on cobbled roads. Within the city walls, shops begin to creak open, and stalls unfold like sleeping lotus petals. Street vendors, known as banias and kansamars, begin their day early, setting up iron griddles, kindling their fires with dried dung cakes, and arranging piles of lentils, wheat flour, and jaggery on palm leaf mats. For the ordinary denizen of the Sultanate, a potter, a soldier, a washerman, or a spice seller breakfast was often humble. Flatbreads of coarse barley or millet, sometimes dipped in lentil porridge, perhaps a shard of dried mango pickle for flavour. Street vendors sold these meals to the bustling working class, their stalls simple constructions shaded with fronds or jute sacking, nestled beside drainage ditches or city walls. But unlike the tantalizing variety one might expect from modern Indian street food, the options were few, and hygiene was more a matter of belief than biology. Milk curdled slowly in clay pots with no refrigeration. Water for lentil stew came from public wells or sometimes the Yamuna River, which, although considered sacred, carried more than just blessings in its current. Pots were rarely scrubbed. Hands were wiped on aprons stained with the labour of the day before, and yet the aromas were inviting. Oil crackled as chickpea flour batter sizzled in cauldrons. On feast days, sweetened rice and saffron-scented fritters might appear, fragrant with ghee and perfumed rosewater. Though one had to be careful, imitation saffron and spoiled ghee were not uncommon. A coin might buy you a skewer of minced meat grilled over coals, or a cone of parched rice seasoned with rock salt and tamarind pulp. Vendors advertised their wares not with signs, but by singing their dishes aloud as they roamed the alleys. These calls rose and fell like lullabies. Hot lentil cakes, fresh lime leaf fritters, spiced water cooled in clay. But in a city of over 500,000 souls, where waste was seldom removed, and flies congregated like pilgrims at a shrine, contamination was more norm than exception. Delhi streets, while lively, were not clean. Open gutters often flowed beside food stalls. Food was left uncovered, exposed to dust storms and errant dogs. Few among the commoners questioned such conditions. Food, after all, was sacred. But even sacredness could not purify unboiled milk or spoiled dates. Travellers from distant lands often found their stomachs less forgiving. The famed Moroccan traveller Ibn Battuta, who visited Delhi in the mid-14th century, praised the city's hospitality. But he, like many others, was cautious about where and what he ate. To the untrained visitor, those sizzling morsels might have looked delicious, but beneath the golden crust of a lentil cake, or the spice-soaked lamb shank, lay the hazards of medieval sanitation. Unfiltered water, adulterated ingredients, and improper storage could, and often did, result in unpleasant consequences. Still, even with the risks, hunger often won, and so the people of Delhi, tired, dusty, and drawn by the intoxicating chorus of scents, continued to line up, copper coins in hand, for a taste of the city's humble offerings, a world far removed from the glistening street food carts of today. but rich in rhythm, routine, and the eternal human search for flavor. As you rise from the dusty food stalls and turn your gaze toward the stone heart of Delhi, your path winds toward the inner precincts of the city, the realm not of potters and bakers, but of sultans and viziers. The reign of Sultan Muhammad bin Tughlaq, who ruled from 1325 to 1351, looms large over this period, a man whose name still echoes through the corridors of South Asian history with a blend of awe, bewilderment, and quiet discomfort. Muhammad bin Tughlaq was a man of immense intellect and ambition, deeply immersed in theology, philosophy, and mathematics. Fluent in Persian, Arabic, and Sanskrit, he surrounded himself with scholars and theologians. And yet, for all his learning, his reign was marked by a string of bold, some might say reckless experiments, each with profound consequences for his people, including their dinner plates. One of the most infamous was his decision to shift the capital from Delhi to Daulatabad, nearly 1,200 kilometers to the south. It was a move intended to centralize rule, but it came at a cost. Entire communities were uprooted, artisans and cooks alike, forced to abandon their established shops and clientele, trudging southward under the weight of pots, pans, and spices if they were fortunate enough to carry such things at all. Food supplies along the route dwindled. Temporary encampments sprang up, and with them, impromptu street vendors selling whatever they could, half-fermented grain, dried fish from uncertain sources, water drawn from parched wells. Illness followed like a shadow. In the capital itself, the Sultan's economic reforms had unintended effects. He attempted to replace traditional gold and silver currency with brass and copper coins, a concept ahead of its time, but disastrously executed. Counterfeit coins flooded the market, leading to inflation, hoarding, and economic collapse. The cost of food soared. Bread became a luxury. Salt was weighed like silver. And still, Muhammad bin Tughlaq ate well. In the royal kitchen's vast chambers echoing with the clang of ladles and the hiss of roasting meats, food was prepared with painstaking attention. The Sultan's diet reflected the tastes of a cosmopolitan court. Dishes included Persian stews with apricots and almonds, Turkish kebabs glazed in honey, and Indian rice pilafs speckled with saffron and slivers of pistachio. Roasted quail might be stuffed with spiced pomegranate seeds, served beside sweet tamarind chutneys and bowls of rose-scented curd. These dishes were meticulously prepared. Filtered water boiled in brass vessels, food kept beneath muslin cloths to deter flies. Court physicians' hakims advised on digestive tonics and dietary balance, prescribing cardamom-infused drinks or crushed fennel seeds after meals. But the divide between palace and street was immense. While nobles reclined on carpets, eating from gilded trays, Delhi's street vendors struggled to find clean grain. Their stews were often thinned with water, their lentils gritty with husk. For commoners, meat was rare, ghee more dream than staple. The Sultan's opulence did not trickle down. Instead, it cast a long shadow in which Delhi's less fortunate found themselves stretching a handful of rice to feed an entire family. Muhammad bin Tughlaq's reign eventually faltered under the weight of his own experiments. Famine, rebellions, and discontent spread, and through it all, food, once a source of community and comfort, became another point of suffering and division. So, while the street food of 14th century Delhi had its spices, its stories, and its faithful customers, it was also shaped by the decisions of one man, a ruler whose brilliance could not always temper the consequences of his ideas. As we leave the palace behind and wander again toward the busy bazaars, the air thick with the mingled scent of incense and frying batter, we begin to glimpse another dimension of this world, hidden beneath stone and soil, waiting to be unearthed. As night deepens and the bustle of medieval Delhi begins to still, imagine walking through the ruins of the old city today, through the crumbled gateways of Siri, past the time-worn tombs of Houskars, and over the ancient dust of Khilji and Tughlaq dynasties. Beneath your feet lie centuries of buried stories, and among them, quiet remnants of daily sustenance. Archaeological discoveries in and around 14th century Delhi offer a muted, yet fascinating window into its culinary past. In the layered soils of former neighborhoods and palace kitchens, fragments of terracotta cooking pots, iron tandoor grates, and even soot-blackened ladles have been unearthed. Simple tools that once clanged and simmered with life. Traces of carbonized grains, barley, millet, and rice linger in the ash of ancient hearths. Occasionally, charred lentils are found pressed into ceramic shards, silent testimonies to meals once shared, perhaps dropped in haste or abandoned in the confusion of war or fire. These clues speak not of feasts, but of routine, of repetition, simplicity, and survival. In the remains of what may have been street-side kitchens, archaeologists have observed narrow cooking platforms fashioned from compacted earth and brick. These were not ornate spaces, nor chimneys, nor elaborate decoration, just a flat surface, a fire pit, and proximity to passing foot traffic. It's not difficult to imagine a vendor standing there, grinding chickpeas with a stone mortar, pouring batter into shallow pans, and calling out to the crowd. And yet, curiously, there is so much we cannot find. Spices, the very soul of Delhi's cuisine, leave little trace behind. Black pepper, cumin, cardamom, all vanish into the soil, their fragrant oils evaporated with time. Only indirect hints remain. A perforated clay spoon, perhaps once used to drain fried pakoras. A bowl stained with what chemical analysis suggests might have been tamarind paste. One particularly intriguing discovery came from the ruins of Firoz Shah Kotla, a fortress palace built not long after Muhammad bin Tughlaq's reign. Deep within what appears to have been a storeroom, researchers found tightly sealed jars, long desiccated, containing dried fruits, raisins, jujube berries, possibly even figs. While far from intact, their presence confirms trade routes still pulsing through Delhi, bringing dried produce from distant gardens into the heart of the capital. Some structures hint at large-scale food preparation, possibly for public kitchens or communal feeding during festivals. These sites suggest a blend of generosity and pragmatism. A tandoor embedded in stone here, a well-worn grinding basin there, but always modest, always functional. No golden platters, no written recipes. Unlike medieval Europe or China, 14th century Delhi's street food left behind no cookbooks. Its legacy was oral, passed from one vendor to another, taught through demonstration, preserved through routine rather than written record. The food of the streets, ephemeral by nature, faded like the scent of roasting cumin on a passing wind. And yet the absence is its own kind of presence. What we cannot find reminds us how precious the fleeting details of daily life are. The laughter of a child chewing on sticky sweetmeats, the clatter of pots in morning rush, the soft hiss of dough puffing in hot oil, all gone, yet somehow still there, in soot, in stone, in silence. From these delicate clues, a picture emerges. A city that cooked constantly, fed millions, and yet vanished its recipes like whispers in the night. Let us now step back from the archaeologist's trench and return to the living, to the people who bought and sold that food, who feasted or fell ill by its hand, to the ways daily cuisine shaped and reflected society itself. As twilight settles into full darkness and lamps flicker behind lattice windows, we now turn to the social fabric of 14th century Delhi, a complex web of caste, class, and cultural divide, woven together by the common thread of food. To understand the street food of Delhi, one must first understand who was eating it and who wasn't. For the labouring classes, artisans, guards, porters, and vendors themselves, the food stalls were not a novelty or indulgence. They were a necessity. Homes were modest, and many lacked proper kitchens. Cooking fuel, like firewood or dung cakes, was expensive and scarce. So, daily meals often came from the street. Thick lentil porridge called kitra, flatbreads griddled on iron pans, or occasionally bits of meat stewed in thin, oily broths. These meals were heavy on carbohydrates, moderate in spice, and minimal in freshness. There was little concept of refrigeration. Leftovers, if any, were rarely kept. Many ate with their hands, squatting by the roadside or beneath a shade tree, wiping mouths on sleeves before returning to work. By contrast, the wealthy nobles, merchants, foreign dignitaries inhabited an entirely different culinary universe. In the high-walled mansions of Delhi's elite, food was both sustenance and display. Lavish meals were served in silver or porcelain, with courses timed to the rhythms of poetry and music. Dishes were complex, layered, and influenced by Persian, Central Asian, and Indian traditions alike. Spices were blended by hand cinnamon, nutmeg, mace in exacting proportions. Sauces were strained through silk. Ice, imported from the distant mountains, sometimes chilled drinks in the heat of summer. Yet for all their refinement, even the nobles remained cautious about eating beyond their walls. Street food was rarely trusted by the upper classes. There was the issue of caste. Purity food prepared by hands of uncertain background could be considered polluting. But just as pressing were concerns over cleanliness and quality. Many elite households employed Milwaukee's personal cooks, who supervised every detail of sourcing and preparation. Water was filtered through linen, rice washed 7 times. Meat was chosen by weight and smell, not merely appearance. To be seen eating from a roadside stall could be socially damaging for a noble or courtier. It suggested desperation or poor judgment. Foreign visitors navigated these distinctions with care. Chinese traveller Ma Huan and the famed Ibn Battuta, both of whom visited India during or near this era, recorded their observations with curiosity, noting the abundance of street food, but often choosing to dine in private quarters or under the hospitality of hosts. Even they, insulated by status and experience, understood the risks. But among the common folk, street food was also community. Vendors often served the same neighborhood day after day. Regulars knew which stalls used fresh oil, which added too much chili, which offered the best pickle on Thursdays. Children were sent with copper coins to fetch supper. Gossip was exchanged as dishes were plated. Despite its hazards, street food offered familiarity and comfort in a world where survival was never guaranteed. It was also, in some ways, the great equalizer. A beggar might eat beside a traveling merchant, a foot soldier beside a village priest. No table separated them. No cloth was laid. Just a shared moment over hot bread or chickpea stew. Yet behind this shared experience, class remained ever present, invisible, but deeply felt. Those who could afford better ate better. Those who could not adjusted expectations and sometimes paid the price. So while the aroma of fried dough and lentils might drift freely through the air of medieval Delhi, it did not reach every nostril equally. For some, it meant warmth and a full belly. For others, just a distant temptation. As we leave behind this tapestry of contrasts, let us now wander further to the sacred, the ceremonial, and the role of food not just in the stomach, but in the spirit. The night deepens, and the stars above Delhi shimmer faintly in the dry air, their light reflected in the domes of mosques and the still pools of stepwells. In this quiet hour, let us reflect on a deeper dimension of food in the 14th century, not simply as nourishment or trade, but as a vessel for devotion, ritual, and reflection. Delhi in the 14th century was a crossroads of belief. The dominant faith under the Tughlaqs was Islam, brought by rulers and migrants from Central Asia and Persia, but alongside it pulsed the older spiritual traditions of Hinduism, as well as traces of Jainism and Buddhism, each with its own deeply rooted relationship to food. Among Muslims, food was both a daily blessing and a central part of religious observance. The Quran and Hadiths outlined not just dietary restrictions forbidding pork and prescribing ritual slaughter, but also emphasized cleanliness, charity, and gratitude in the act of eating. The fast of Ramadan was already firmly established, bringing a rhythm of abstinence and nightly feasting that transformed the streets of Delhi each year. As dusk fell during Ramadan, stalls that had been shuttered through the day would spring to life. Oil lamps flickered as vendors served iftar, the evening meal to break the fast. Dates, water, and simple porridges were most common, followed by heartier dishes like stewed lentils or grilled meats. For the poor, mosques and charitable kitchens sometimes distributed free meals, paid for by wealthier patrons fulfilling religious obligations. The atmosphere was festive, yet reverent, the act of breaking the fast, deeply communal, yet profoundly personal. Meanwhile, within Hindu communities, food was woven into a vast network of ritual and symbolism. Offerings, or prasada, were made daily to household deities, typically consisting of rice, sweets, fruits, and milk. In temples, elaborate food preparations known as naivedya were made with great care and devotion, to be later distributed among worshippers. These dishes were strictly vegetarian, prepared without onion or garlic, and made in a state of ritual purity. Even the water used was drawn from specific wells and filtered through sacred cloths. Certain foods were considered cooling or warming according to Ayurvedic principles. and seasonal fasts were common, abstaining from salt, grains, or particular vegetables depending on the occasion. For example, during Ekadashi, a lunar fast observed by many devout Hindus, street food vendors would adjust their wares, offering dishes made with water, chestnut flour, or tapioca pearls, cooked over a slow flame with minimal oil. Jains, a smaller but present community, took these restrictions further still. Committed to non-violence in all aspects, they abstained not only from meat, but from root vegetables like onions, garlic, and potatoes, which involved uprooting and thus harming the plant. Their meals were typically home-cooked, simple, and consumed before sunset to avoid harming unseen insects after dark. These varying traditions shaped what was eaten, how it was prepared, and when it was served. And though street vendors catered primarily to the secular appetites of passers-by, they were still influenced by these rhythms. During festival seasons, for example, certain stalls would vanish, replaced by temporary sweet shops selling ladus, barfis, or deep-fried spirals of jalebi, drenched in saffron syrup. And across all faiths, charity through food was a shared virtue. Wealthy patrons might sponsor a public meal, feeding dozens of strangers to earn spiritual merit. Sufi shrines, which dotted the city's landscape, often provided simple meals to pilgrims, travelers, and the poor, regardless of creed. Cooked rice with ghee, lentils, and sweet milk porridge were common offerings. To sit cross-legged among strangers, eating from a shared bowl, was not just an act of hunger but of humility and connection. In these sacred contexts, food became more than physical. It bridged the earthly and the divine, the individual and the community. It was a gift, a symbol, a prayer. But even in such elevated moments, the realities of the street lingered nearby. A contaminated batch of curd, a poorly cleaned ladle, even food meant as holy offering could carry unseen risks. The boundaries between sanctity and sickness were thin, and so, in the dim light of devotion, the promise and peril of 14th century street food remained ever present, ever entwined. Now, let us wander away from the temple steps and mosque courtyards, and return to the heart of the city, to the rhythms of trade, travellers, and the curious exchange of culinary ideas along Delhi's dusty roads. As midnight drapes itself gently over the plains, and the sounds of the day fade into a hush, imagine the gentle creak of caravan wheels, and the soft clatter of hooves approaching the gates of 14th century Delhi. Through these gates passed not just people and goods, but spices, stories, and meals from across the known world. Delhi, under the Tughlaqs, was a nexus of international trade. Caravans arrived from the silk markets of Persia, the horse bazaars of Central Asia, and the spice islands of the south. From the Indian Ocean to the far reaches of Samarkand, travellers converged on the city merchants with embroidered fabrics, scholars with scrolls, and cooks with tastes and techniques shaped by distant lands. With them came ingredients unfamiliar to local tongues: dried apricots, pine nuts, rosewater, dried fish, and foreign varieties of wheat and dates. These goods trickled into Delhi's market stalls and kitchens, where curious cooks adapted them to local traditions. Persian and Central Asian influences had a particular hold over the elite kitchens of Delhi. The technique of slow-cooking meats in sealed pots, the dum method, likely entered Indian cuisine through these routes, as did the use of dried fruits in savoury dishes, a style distinct from native Indian preparations. Street vendors, eager to attract customers, began to mimic these elite trends in simplified forms. Thus, a humble kebab stall in a crowded alley might flavour its ground lamb with hints of clove and cinnamon, or roast meat over a makeshift charcoal grill to imitate tandoori preparation. From the south came black pepper and tamarind, prized not just for their flavour but for their supposed medicinal benefits. Tamarind water was often sold as a cooling drink, sometimes laced with a dash of crushed rock salt. Its tangy flavour both refreshed, and some believed, protected against heat stroke. Chinese traders brought not only silk but dried noodles and pickled vegetables. Though these never took hold in Delhi's mainstream cuisine, some wealthier households experimented with incorporating them into feast day platters. Even Mongol mercenaries in the service of the Sultanate introduced new methods of meat preservation: sun-dried strips rubbed in coarse salt and ground herbs, useful for soldiers on long campaigns, but sometimes sold on the streets as a travel snack. And then there were the traders from the Arab world, who contributed to the expansion of rice cultivation, the import of exotic dates, and the increased use of rose essence in desserts. Fernie, a chilled rice pudding perfumed with rose or cura, became a popular sweet not just in royal households, but also among the wealthier vendor stalls during festival seasons. But not all foreign influence was welcomed with open arms. Culinary conservatism was common. New ingredients were often viewed with suspicion, their origins unclear, their purity doubted. Local taboos, particularly around caste and faith, restricted the wholesale adoption of foreign dishes. While nobles experimented with layered pilafs and saffron-scented stews, many commoners preferred the familiarity of flatbreads and lentils. And among the street vendors, innovation was necessarily limited by cost and access. Exotic spices were expensive. Dried fruits were hoarded by merchants for export. Even onions and garlic, considered basic now, were not always part of daily meals due to their relative cost. Yet, slowly and subtly, these outside influences filtered down. A traveller might barter a handful of cinnamon in exchange for a hot meal. A Persian clerk, homesick, might ask a local cook to recreate a stew from Shiraz. Recipes shifted, techniques blurred, and a hybrid cuisine neither wholly foreign nor purely native began to take shape. This mingling of culinary ideas mirrored Delhi itself, a city constantly in flux, absorbing waves of language, art, architecture, and appetite. And in the smoky twilight of the food stalls, as travellers and townsfolk rubbed shoulders beneath oil lamps, you could sometimes taste this convergence, a spoonful of rice that hinted at rose, a fritter spiced with distant pepper, a tangy broth flavoured with foreign roots, all part of a grand exchange, carried not on the tongues of diplomats, but on the plates of the hungry. From here, let us turn inward not to food itself, but to its silent aftermath, the illnesses that followed, the remedies sought, the ancient medical practices that attempted, in their own way, to treat the consequences of the street food experience. The city slumbers, but not all its residents sleep easily. In the cramped alleyways behind the market stalls, behind shuttered doors and beneath thin wool blankets, some toss and turn, their bellies churn, their brows sweat, and beside them, a bowl of tamarind stew, or a poorly cooked lentil cake, sits half-eaten, cooling in the night air. Food in 14th century Delhi, while often flavourful and filling, came with no guarantees. Without modern sanitation, refrigeration, or understanding of microbial life, it was all too easy for a tasty snack to become a source of sickness. The most common ailments were intestinal. Diarrhea, dysentery, and food poisoning were known not by their modern names but by their effects. The symptoms were described in terms of bodily imbalance, too much internal heat, corrupted bile, or weakened digestion. These conditions were not merely inconvenient, they could be life-threatening. Dehydration was swift, and for the poor, physicians were often out of reach. But medical knowledge was far from absent. The courtly elite had access to Hakims, practitioners of Unani medicine, a system rooted in Greco-Arabic tradition and adapted over centuries. These physicians believed that health depended on the balance of four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Foods were categorized as hot, cold, moist, or dry, and treatment began with restoring this balance. For digestive complaints, remedies included syrups of pomegranate or quince, infusions of mint or coriander seed, and cooling preparations made from sandalwood or rose petals. Some patients were given pastes of ground cumin and fennel, or drinks made with diluted vinegar and honey. Charcoal, known even then for its purifying effects, was sometimes administered as a powder. Among the general population, folk remedies were the first line of defense. Elder women often served as household healers, relying on local herbs and traditional knowledge passed down through generations. Roasted asafoetida, known for its pungent aroma and carminative properties, might be wrapped in a cloth and inhaled to ease stomach cramping. Ginger juice was mixed with jaggery to warm the belly. Crushed neem leaves were brewed into bitter teas, thought to cleanse the system. Yet these cures were imperfect. Not every illness had a remedy. Not every herb helped. Some families resorted to prayer, lighting lamps before household shrines and offering boiled rice to the gods in hopes of recovery. Others visited Sufi saints or Hindu ascetics, hoping for a blessing, an amulet, or a whispered verse that might restore health. For the most severe cases, the city's small hospitals, often attached to mosques or funded by wealthy patrons, provided basic care. These facilities were modest, their medicines herbal, their tools simple. Leeches, poultices, and tinctures were used liberally. Water was drawn from carefully chosen wells, filtered through cloth, and cooled in clay jars. But hygiene remained an elusive goal. Hands were not sterilized. Utensils were rarely washed with anything more than water. And understanding of contagion, while intuitive in some respects, lacked scientific foundation. The link between spoiled food and illness was often guessed at, but not fully understood. A man might avoid a certain vendor if others had fallen ill after eating there not because of bacteria, but because of the belief that the vendor's ingredients were impure or their karma misaligned. And so regret became part of the eating ritual. After a street meal, especially one that tasted a little too sour or smelled faintly off, one might lie awake through the night listening to the sounds of one's own body, waiting to see whether fortune would favor digestion or revolt. A single bowl of spoiled curd, a few grains of rice kept too long in the heat, could disrupt a household for days. But still, they returned. The next morning, as the city stirred and fires were rekindled, the vendors returned to their corners. New pots simmered, fresh dough was rolled, spices were ground anew. The risks were forgotten, or perhaps accepted, for food was not a luxury, but a need. And in a world of uncertain harvests, distant rulers, and wandering illness, a hot meal offered a fleeting moment of comfort, even if it came with a cost. Now, with this fragile balance in mind between pleasure and peril, between flavor and fever, let us step back and look at the broader picture, how Delhi's street food scene evolved over time, and what shadows of it still remain in the present day. The sky begins to lighten, and with it, our journey draws near its end. But before we leave 14th century Delhi behind, let us pause to consider what traces of its bustling food stalls, smoky kitchens, and spice-laden air still remain in the present. For all its discomforts and dangers, the world of medieval Delhi's street food laid quiet foundations for culinary traditions that would endure, adapt, and flourish in the centuries to follow. As the Sultanate gave way to the Mughal Empire, Delhi's cuisine evolved. The Mughals brought with them not only wealth and opulence, but a deeply refined palate. Techniques were elevated, ingredients diversified, and culinary artistry began to flourish in ways previously unseen. The simple kebabs of Tughlaq-era bazaars became the melt-in-your-mouth Sikh kebabs and galuti kebabs of Mughal courts. The modest meat and rice combinations of vendors matured into the intricate, layered biryanis and aromatic pulaus that Delhi would come to be known for. But these transformations were not confined to palaces. Street food, ever resourceful, adopted and imitated. What began in royal kitchens filtered down through imitation and improvisation. Spices became more widely available, preservation methods improved, and with the advent of new materials like tin, porcelain, and brass, vendors could offer food in more sanitary and varied ways. By the time of the late Mughal period, and later the colonial era, Delhi's food vendors had begun to establish distinct identities. Chatwalas, halways, pakorawalas. Each stall specialized in a type of preparation, creating a familiar urban rhythm that survives to this day. Yet, the roots of this evolution lie in the very time we've explored. The 14th century street food scene, for all its simplicity and danger, was an engine of innovation and adaptation. It absorbed foreign influences, responded to economic upheavals, and reflected the values and struggles of the common people. In a city marked by constant change-shifting capitals, eccentric rulers, economic experiments, food provided a fragile sense of continuity. Today, if you were to wander the old lanes of Shahjahanabad or the winding alleys near Jama Masjid, you might taste echoes of that earlier era. A skewer of meat grilled over open flame, a lentil fritter served with a dash of tangy chutney, a ladle of rice porridge spiced just so. Modern sanitation and awareness have thankfully changed much, but the essence, the street-side generosity, the everyday ritual of shared food that still lingers. And yet, one must remember how far we have come. Now, water is filtered, food safety regulated, illnesses treatable. The consequences of a poorly cooked dish are no longer as dire, but it took centuries of suffering, learning, and adaptation to get here. And behind each plate of savory Delhi street food today lies a lineage that includes not just recipes, but memories of hardship, resilience, and survival. So, as the first stall opens and morning tea begins to simmer, we leave behind the 14th century not with disdain, but with understanding. A time and place where a simple bite could be a blessing or a burden. As you lie now in stillness, wrapped in the warmth of your present comforts, let your mind drift from the dusty streets of old Delhi, the murmur of a distant market fading like a forgotten dream. Think of the people tired, hungry, hopeful, waiting in line for a modest meal. Picture the flickering lamps, the scent of smoke and spice, the clang of pots in the dark. History, after all, is not made only by kings and wars, but by hands that knead dough, by voices that call out over bubbling pans, by footsteps that pause for food in the quiet of evening. And though you now sleep under clean sheets, in a world of light switches and filtered taps, somewhere deep in the past, in a time without medicine or menus, someone just like you once stood on a street corner in Delhi, wondering whether to take a bite. Let the past settle softly around you, like dust on stone. Close your eyes and rest well.